Over the last few months, as the leaders in our diocese have come together over various different times through our ministry camp, through our leaders retreat, one of the things that has stood out to us both has been the kind of primacy of prayer that's been on people's hearts, and the call to be a people of prayer, and the call to be people who lead others into prayer. And so we just thought that it would be a good opportunity for us to share a little bit more from our own perspectives about what that call has been like in our lives and what it means to be a person of prayer and to lead other people into prayer. So Justin, can I ask you to share how for you being someone who's been called to prayer has shaped the way that you've lived out your life in Christ?
Yeah, sure, Ali. I mean, first of all, I've got to say, look, I'm an activist, so like my natural orientation has never been growing up one towards prayer, like, I just want to do action. Mm-hmm. But I think why I love prayer is because in prayer I remember it's God's church and it's God's kingdom and it's not Justin's. Mm. And I think that's, for me, it is that the first thing about prayer is a sense where you remind yourself of your loyalty, your fidelity to Christ and to Christ's way, not your way. And I think for me that is huge. The second thing for me about prayer is that what God calls us to, and it's true now for the diocese, what God calls us to is actually beyond ourselves. Mm-hmm. Like you're really gifted, I think you're onto it, and though actually we still can't achieve what we need to achieve, what God's calling us to do, we actually need the power of God to actually enable His church and empower His church. And I think prayer is where that happens. Prayer is where we just cry out to God and say, God, we need your miracles daily. Mm.
And I think for me, prayer is kind of a really simple word, which kind of underneath just means so much. I mean, prayer is a very human word, and prayer again talks about what we do as humans. But really, to be called into prayer and to call to prayer is to call yourself beyond your humanity. And prayer is that word that we use that is this beautiful conversation between God and us. And it's not just a human thing, though, because we talk about the whole of creation kind of calling out in various ways. And so we could speak about the way that prayer actually is not just the human voice articulating conversations or questions to God or the silences, but actually the whole of creation. And so I find it jars with me, and it always has, when I've been in Christian rooms when Jesus is obviously present, because when 2 or 3 gather in Christ's name and no one says hello to Jesus. It drives me mad.
Yeah, totally.
Because it's like we're only there because the living Lord is there, and we're only there because we've been called into this space by the living presence of Jesus. So when we then enter into that space, for us then not to speak to or with the living Christ, and knowing that that isn't the sort of conversation that you can have in the way that we can talk. Sometimes it requires us to be humble and to accept silence, but even to not have a space of silence for me is it just makes it's nonsensical.
Yeah. Because
we're only there because God is there. And so if there's ever a meeting we're in, if there's ever a gathering of us humans, the human part of the church, and we do not give space for the divine voice or the divine heart, the divine spirit to fill us in some way, then we are not being the church. Yeah. We're being a bunch of humans gathering together.
Yeah. What I noticed is when we had the week of prayer leading up actually to your ordination, what I experienced myself and what I experienced the diocese doing is, I think we engage with prayer at a deeper level. I remember being in the cathedral from like for 3 hours from 2 till 5 in the morning, I think it was, a couple of times. But often we do prayer as just it's a kind of thing you do on the way to something else. But what I experienced that week, and what I noticed many in the diocese experiencing, is instead this deep sense of sitting in prayer and wrestling in prayer and allowing God's Spirit, allowing enough time for God's Spirit to actually transform our lives and empower our lives and to speak to us. And I think that's that deep wrestling, that deep sense of prayer that I think we experienced in that week, and I think that's what we're encouraging the diocese to experience ongoing, is not prayer as just a sort of, you know, stop along the way because you have to do it, but actually instead this sense of deep calling to deep.
And for me, one of the most influential seasons of my life was the time I spent with Kagera, with the Diocese of Kagera in Tanzania and the women there. And I was with them journeying with conversations around how the practicality, the activist part of their faith, the community development work that they did of income generation, literacy training, the very practical community development work, integrated with what you might say the more spiritual parts of their lives of prayer. And being with them, the way that they approach life was in a very holistic sense. Their culture, their way of being hasn't been formed by the same kind of oppositions of our history in terms of body and matter, spirit and matter, these dualisms that separate out. Their culture is one of holism. And our Tangata Whenua will have a similar kind of holistic culture whereby everything is spiritual, everything is material, all those things come together. And so for them, the way that they engage with my research, as well as the way that they continue to live out their community development, was so infused with a prayerful being in all that they did. And it was this deep irony for me that I was with them and letting prayer so fill the way of being. I was in that deep way of being, and then coming back to our Western expression of the church, and the absence of prayer was such a stark contrast for me. And I think that one of our calls as the people of God at this point and in these lands and at this time is to call us back to a deeper, more ancient way of being human, which is in the Hebrew language our soul, nafesh, which means our entirety.
Yeah.
So that our entirety is always present to the entirety of God, because that's the invitation and that's the gift of Christ.
So can we encourage you as a diocese to deeply walk into prayer in this next season? And why? Well, simply because we don't want you to miss out. Our experience is that as we deepen our prayer life, our lives become so enlivened with the divine amongst us. So pray deeply.